If the history of the Roman Empire was translated into seasons, the Pax Romana would be Rome's summer. An age perceived as a golden one, stable, where wealth was sustained by a senatorial elite deeply rooted in tradition. But as the affluence of this elite grew, so too did its decadence, eroding the cohesion that held the empire together. The descendants of the people that founded the Roman Empire, its elites, its senators, its leading citizens, began to view their inherited legacy not as a treasure to defend, but as a burden, a constraint on their personal interests and fortunes, and perhaps even their comforts. This gradual complacency opened the door to those with greater hunger and greater unity. And you might think I'm talking about barbarians from beyond Roman borders, but no, today I'm talking about why the military replaced Rome's elites. Episode 82, Why the Military Replaced Rome's Elites. The period that we have been looking at lately, the Tetrarchy, and also to a certain extent the crisis of the 3rd century, marks the fall season of Rome, a time when the old senatorial elite was supplanted by new holders of power. The military didn't take over by means of a sudden catastrophe, but through a gradual unraveling as the old elite failed to protect their legacy, and those who had a stronger will and more social cohesion and collective loyalty stepped into the vacuum. The Pax Romana spanned the reign of Augustus to the death of Marcus Aurelius, that is, roughly 31 BC through 180 AD. This was a period of relative peace and prosperity in the Roman world. There were some challenges and some problems, but certainly compared to what came after, that period was, in all respects, a summer period in Roman history. After centuries of civil wars and republican strife, Augustus established a stable imperial system where he consolidated power at the same time preserving the facade of the old republic. The senatorial elites that were left over, and these were wealthy landowners who traced their lineage to Rome's founding families in some cases, they played a central role in the new imperial government. These aristocratic families governed through a sophisticated system of patronage. They offered protection and favors to their clients in exchange for loyalty and political support. They managed vast estates across Italy and also the Roman provinces. They produced the staples of the empire: grain, wine, olive oil, the major goods that fueled the Roman economy and fed the citizens of the cities. The wealth of these elites was staggering. Senators earned thousands of times more wealth in a year than the average Roman peasant. And this concentration of elite wealth underpinned the Pax Romana's cultural and material achievements. Cities like Rome, but also Eastern capitals like Antioch and Alexandria, flourished as elites built grand temples, aqueducts, amphitheaters, libraries. Elite demand for luxury goods sustained trade routes that connected the Roman Empire internally from Britain to Egypt, but also the demand for luxury goods connected the Roman Empire with the outside world as well, generating demand for silks from China, spices from India. But there were some vulnerabilities. And here I'd like to draw on a term used by historian Peter Turchin: asabaya. Asabaya describes the social cohesion and collective loyalty of a particular group. For senators and other elites in the Pax Romana, their asabaya was rooted in shared privilege and tradition, but it was also brittle. These men increasingly had less to do with defending and protecting the empire's frontiers, and more to do with consuming the wealth of the empire for purposes of gaining and displaying social status. And so as the Pax Romana unfolded, Roman elites grew accustomed to their affluence. They indulged in lavish lifestyles, building opulent villas adorned with mosaics, hosting extravagant banquets. Even when senators held meaningful political positions, governorships, consulships, many treated these roles as ceremonial. And the real work of running the empire was delegated to military commanders, freedmen, that is, former slaves, and other non-elites. I want to focus especially on the military. Under Rome's first emperor, Augustus, the military was about 300,000 men, stationed largely along the borders of the Roman Empire, along the Rhine, the Danube, and along the Syrian border with Persia. These soldiers, over time, became increasingly drawn from diverse provinces, non-Italian regions, where loyalty to the emperor personally was far more important than to the Senate or some kind of abstract Roman ideals. Professionalizing the military like this made a lot of sense. These were specialists. They did not have attachments to families, at least legally. They lived together, marching together, eating and drinking together. They lived in fortified camps, often for decades, forming tight-knit communities with their own subculture. But this distinctiveness, this separation, sowed the seeds for the military's asabaya, their collective sense of unity and loyalty. And this was stronger than that of the senatorial elites, whose cohesion came from inherited privilege, consumption, and increasingly abstract ceremony. Soldiers' unity was forged through shared hardship, on the other hand, long marches, battles, life on the frontier. Their loyalty to each other and their commanders grew stronger than their attachment to a distant Rome. This was not obviously a unique phenomenon to, say, the 3rd century. Julius Caesar relied on exactly this same thing to take over the Roman Republic. So even though the Pax Romana was politically stable, under the surface there was a growing divide. It peaked out at times like in the year of the 4 emperors, which we covered earlier on this podcast. Just check out episode 22. In that year, rival generals fought for the throne, hinting at the military's potential to disrupt the senatorial order. Some of the Pax Romana emperors were able to mobilize Rome's military and occupy them through wars of expansion, which promised wealth, land, and for non-Roman soldiers, citizenship. Trajan, for example, in his annexation of Dacia and Mesopotamia, did this. This was a campaign that enriched soldiers with plunder, helping to maintain their loyalty to the emperor and to the Roman state. And I covered that war on episode 30 of this podcast. But by the 2nd century, especially under Hadrian and the emperors that followed, expansion slowed. Geographic barriers like rivers and mountains and deserts, also the boundary with Parthia, placed limits on further conquests. As the Pax Romana ended, the empire began to stagnate. The Antonine Plague, covered in episode 50, was part of a package of crises which led to some major demographic shifts in the empire's population, as well as economic constraints. As a result, soldier salaries were affected, desertions rose, migrations increased, banditry and crime proliferated in the provinces, and those soldiers that remained with the military had nowhere to go but inward, towards the very empire they protected. So by fostering a professional but rootless military, Rome inadvertently turned its own citizens and protectors into a kind of barbarian. They were insiders, but at the same time, they were outsiders. They lacked a stake in the society they defended, and this alienation eroded their loyalty to the Roman state and replaced it with their own internal asabaya, forged through shared hardship and a kind of exclusion. Unlike senatorial elites whose cohesion came from the inherited privilege and tradition and customs, the military's asabaya was, by contrast, dynamic. It was built on the crucible of frontier life, surviving ambushes, enduring harsh winters, relying on comrades in battle, loyalty to generals. These were men who spent much of their life far away from the monumental cities of the Roman Empire. Whenever they happened to see senatorial wealth, some no doubt compared this to their meager pay, the dangers that they faced, and their situation on the margins of the empire. Elites like Cassius Dio vilified Roman soldiers and the emperors that patronized them. It's easy to imagine that soldiers began to resent elites and to question why they protected a society that they no longer belonged to. Another reason the military took over, and it marries well with Peter Turchin's idea about asabaya, is meritocracy. The senators of the Pax Romana enjoyed inherited or unearned power and status. Their competitive efforts were largely based on consuming their own capital rather than acquiring more of it. But the military was a meritocracy. It rewarded skill and courage and dedication. By the time we get to the crisis of the 3rd century, we see many soldier emperors that were once commoners, and it marked a kind of turning point as elites cycled. As you know from recent episodes of this podcast, the crisis of the 3rd century represented a revolving door of emperors and other ruling elites. Many of them soldier emperors, some of them traditional senators. The first of these soldier emperors was Maximinus Thrax, a Thracian, the first emperor elevated solely by military acclaim, bypassing senatorial approval. I think his rise was a bit of a shock to the traditional elite, and subsequent emperors, in order to secure the loyalty of the military rather than traditional elites, engaged in constant warfare, invasions, coin debasements. Diocletian himself was born to a peasant family and rose to become emperor through the military, illustrating the upward mobility available to soldiers. I think this meritocracy gave soldiers a sense of purpose. It gave them pride, and of course reinforced their asabaya. By contrast, senators of the Pax Romana, especially in the 2nd century AD, were deeply guarded about their status, probably because it was unearned. They tried to maintain exclusivity. They vilified wealthy freedmen and other ambitious outsiders, rather than inviting them into their ranks. In other words, the cycling from traditional elites to military elites was messy and painful, and I think the 3rd century was the product of this cycling. And those elites that had stronger asabaya, that is, the military elites, were better positioned to take over the institutions that the old elite could no longer protect. By the time the 3rd century crisis was largely over, with the Tetrarchy period and the rise of Diocletian in the mid-280s, the senatorial elites were a shadow of what they were in the Pax Romana. True power was wielded by military generals. And I think this marks a culmination in the cycling of elites. The military had displaced the old aristocracy. Emperors were now military men, either generals themselves or heavily dependent upon generals and military tactics and training to maintain control, not just of politics, but as we saw last time, of things like the economy and society and culture. And as we'll see later on in this podcast, the dominance of the military will only increase as we get into the 5th century. There's a lot more that could be said about why the military took over from traditional Roman elites, but I think Peter Turchin's ideas about Asabaya offer a compelling framework. But for now, I think we can see that this new Roman Empire, what some would call the Dominate, that began around the time of Diocletian, vividly illustrates a cycling of elites, where the senatorial aristocracy of the Pax Romana gave way to military generals and eventually foreign leaders. This shift, driven by the military's superior Asabaya, forged through shared hardship and alienation, reveals why Rome's soldiers became its rulers. It was a combination of senatorial elites' complacency and detachment, and at the same time, the strengths of military unity. Rome created professional soldiers to defend its borders, but in making those men professional and detaching them from their identity in Roman society, Roman elites created a kind of insider group of barbarians that would eventually take over their empire, transforming the Pax Romana into the militarized Roman dominate of the 4th and 5th centuries AD.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exelcore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.